Hello, I'm Kate Gardner, Executive Director of Alpha Sigma Nu. This afternoon, we warmly welcome Michael Sheeran of the Society of Jesus, President of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. Father Sheeran has served in this role since April 1st of 2013. Prior to his arrival at AJCU, Father Sheeran was the President of Regis University in Denver from 1993 to 2012. Father Sheeran entered the Society of Jesus in 1957 and was ordained a priest in 1970. He earned his doctorate in politics from Princeton University in 1977. In his role as AJCU president, Father Sheeran leads AJCU in representing Jesuit higher education among its various constituencies, in providing a forum for the exchange of information and experiences in Jesuit higher education, and in encouraging and facilitating collaborative initiatives amongst its member institutions. These initiatives include fostering Jesuit Catholic identity and mission, educating for a faith that does justice, supporting national, international, and online collaborations between campuses, representing Jesuit higher education at the federal level, and sponsoring professional and leadership development programs. Under his leadership, the AJCU has guided the U.S. 27 Jesuit colleges and universities in the inaugural Mission Priority Examen. He's also played an important role in the development of the International Association of Jesuit Universities, the IAJU, for which he serves as one of the two representatives from the North American region. A key priority for Father Sheeran has been overseeing the Ignatian formation of lay leaders at Jesuit colleges and universities. And most recently, the AJCU has launched a pilot forum for trustees of our schools to learn more about leading with purpose and mission. During his tenure in DC, Father Sheeran has been an outspoken advocate for undocumented and DACA students on Jesuit campuses. I thank Father Sheeran for being with us today on Alpha Sigma Nu's Spring Lunch and Learn webinar, and by the way, bringing us a little piece of Ireland, in order that he can speak to us on the important topic, Jesuit higher education, facing the challenges of the pandemic. Father Sheeran.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to all of you for listening in. I presume that many of you are indeed enjoying your lunch, and it's nice to be able to share with you what's going on at our schools right now when, in fact, everything seems to be in total chaos, and in fact, I'm afraid in many ways it is. As I got this talk ready, I received a couple of early questions, one from John Panagiatou, who is a Wheeling graduate and is I believe, a Greek Orthodox theologian, and another from Father Tom Hewson, a Jesuit retired now at Marquette and a theologian. And so I will try in the course of what I'm saying to build in some responses to things that they raised. And at the same time, I've received another that came in just yesterday from Michael Canaris, who is at Loyola in the Institute of Pastoral Studies. And the hope is that during this webinar, if you have questions you want to ask, that you'll click down at the bottom and get your name and topic listed that way. And then Amy O'Neill, who is going to be, if you will, curating the questions, will grab some of the items that have been placed there and join them together, I suppose, and then sum that up for me to try and respond to. What I thought I would do is, in the space of maybe 25 minutes, is to give you an example of the difficulties that our schools are dealing with right now because of the coronavirus. And I figure if I give you one school in a little bit of detail, you'll understand what the others are going through. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about dealing with the Department of Education. I'm trained as a political scientist, but I had always studied people like the Department of Education, and believe me, dealing with them up front and personal is something a little bit different from what I had understood. And then I wanted to just conclude with the overall implications that I see for Jesuit education in the future. And when I finish that, that's the time when we'll go to questions that you have surfaced during the talk. So I should tell you, I'm about to retire. I'm not going to the cliffs of Moher, which you see behind me, but I am happy to pretend that I'm there rather than stuck in a very small room that I live in at Gonzaga Jesuit High School in Washington, D.C. And what I'll be doing is retiring to St. Louis. They will be selecting and announcing my successor in another week or so. Here, my successor. And in St. Louis, I'll be moving into the notorious Jesuit Hall, which is, I think, right now, the largest Jesuit residence. I think there are something over 80 men who live there. And it's going to be torn down happily in 18 months. And that means that for me, either I'll be living with the 20 active men who are at the university, or I'll be living with the 80 fellows who are fully retired, who will be living about a half a mile away in a very workable kind of a retirement center. But at the moment, as I go to St. Louis, I'm also on that board and aware of what this coronavirus has done to that university. This is public information, but I should tell you this is typical of what you find at Jesuit schools across the country. Now, in the average year, St. Louis University receives about $500 million, that's the size of its budget, for the educational side of what they do. They also own share ownership of a hospital and have a large medical practice, which they're responsible for, called SLU Care. And that's a $400 million project. So altogether, that university's annual operations are about $900 million. Now, this year they were doing extremely well, both in the patient care side of things and in the education side, until we got to the moment of the virus. By giving back money pro rata to the students when they went home, and the pro rata refunds of room and board totaled $10 million that the university lost. The money that comes to the university for making up for that from the CARES Act, which was passed about now a month ago, I think, was $2.7 million. So you may have noticed that they were giving $13 billion to public and private higher education and students' emergency needs. But what that really means in terms of what went back to the university was 2.7 million as the beginning, if you will, of an offset of the 10 million that the university had lost. What has happened to the university also, just so you know, is you've all heard about the fall off of elective surgery and of doctor visits because of fear of testing positive after going into a hospital for procedures. And on that, they also lost another $10 million. So instead of being in a very comfortable situation to end the year in the black, they are looking at ending the year, the fiscal year, with a major problem to deal with. This is typical of universities across the country. And what had been asked for originally to be in the CARES Act was much more money than the, I think it's 13 million that was actually in the CARES Act for, million, I said, 13 billion that was in the CARES Act for higher education. The next ask, the next request for the next stimulus, and depending on how you're counting, they call that stimulus 4 or stimulus 5, would be $46 billion for higher ed students and the school's operating expenses. And that would be enough just to keep higher ed afloat financially for the fiscal year. Some schools, by the way, are ending their fiscal years on May the 30th, and others June the 30th, the way a standard business does. And so the amount that these numbers will come out to be is all estimated at this point. But it's good to know what's going on, because there are folks out there already who are saying, don't tell me about higher education. They've already been to the trough. They've got their money. The reality is that all the schools are in the same kind of boat that a strong university like St. Louis U is in right now. And meantime, by the way, their endowment, which is a good endowment, it was $1.3 billion, I believe, has dropped from that to about $1 billion. So they've lost about $300 million in the crash of the stock market. That goes up and down a little bit. But if they go into that endowment, which is where they would have to turn if they wanted to just take care of their debt directly, if they go into that, then of course they're losing the money, some of the money that they depend on to generate financial aid for the kids and other things that are dependent on the endowment. So that's item one. What's the problem? Item two, it's interesting, there is suddenly a new realization of the importance of on-campus education for 18 to 22-year-olds. And you hear that from schools all over the country that typically don't even talk about the importance of that. And I'll explain perhaps why that's the case as we get a little further along. Understand the Jesuit view. When you come to a Jesuit school, you're not coming just for information, but for formation. Understand the residence halls. When I was at Regis, the way I used to explain the residence halls rules were that they were set up so that as you're growing up, you can occasionally stub your toe. But it's a little hard, given those rules, to break your leg. And that's the function of the formative side of those halls. We understand what you've learned yourselves in your own education. God made a good but imperfect world, good but not perfect. And then he created humans to make their part of the world better. And they do it by acting for the common good, by serving Christ, who is hidden in their neighbor. You all have heard Father Urupe's line about being men and women for others. And that's what we want to turn out from our schools, be it high schools or colleges. Now, other schools, especially the publics, have been over the years formally value-free, and they sometimes boast about that. And sometimes because they are so value-free, their campuses are thought of as minimum security holding pens until the kids have grown up enough to release them. I took that from a news columnist a few years ago who struck me as, in his irony, being pretty much on the mark in terms of we don't know what to do with them. They're not yet really mature. And so we give them those years in a public school's residence halls. What that comes down to, though, is the reality today that these schools with their large campus facilities are very, very much part of the education scene in the United States today. And therefore, every school, be it a Jesuit school, a private school of a different stripe, or a public institution, tends to be planning to be on campus in the fall. Maybe like us because it forms kids, maybe just because it pays the bills that will come due. Remember, typically every bed in any of those schools is mortgaged by the loans and bonds that that school carries. And so while everybody is talking about being on campus, every school is developing its own plan B, and sometimes a plan C and a plan D, because they don't know what the COVID-19 epidemic will really function like. So given that, think of the things schools are thinking about, and they're very interesting. And some of these may be so good that you'll find schools going back to this after the virus is a thing of the past. Why not do 2 8-week semesters in the fall? You have only half as many courses, and that way you can have the whole of the fall on campus, or you can have a convenient point in the middle where either people who started by being online because the virus was such a threat back in September, or who got as far as the middle of those 8 weeks, and then the virus set in because there's such fear that when it gets colder, the virus will once again become much more potent. So if you have 2 8-week semesters, each of them half of the fall, that might just work. Or you might get stuck with an all online semester that would go for 16 weeks, and the faculty would have to teach from home even though they want to teach from the classroom. There's also a simple kind of hybrid teaching that schools are thinking about, where the kids can take turns being in their dorm room one day for the class, and then coming to the classroom while the ones who were there the day before are now in their dorm rooms. And so they're getting their semester with the hybrid dimension of taking turns being in class or in the dorm room. And then there's the social distancing issue. We have typically singles, a few, but an awful lot of double rooms in schools across the country. And so one thing that they're exploring, because the hotels are really having trouble getting customers, is making all rooms on campus singles, and then putting up the kids that they can't accommodate at a nearby empty hotel. And so these are different creative things that people are thinking about in higher ed all across the country, and Jesuit schools are certainly part of that. We don't know what the fall is going to be like, so flexibility becomes essential. There are other threats that the schools worry about having to do with the fall. What if the freshmen decide they're just going to stay home? That a lot of kids are going to go to a local community college and avoid the cost of paying for four-year higher education, especially in any independent school. What if the upperclassmen don't all come back? What if the foreign students can't come? And understand the dirty little secret. Foreign students tend to pay full price. So these are the ones who are the most valuable financially to the schools that they go to. The typical school expects to lose 20% of its students. And when we came up with the 46 billion number in terms of what's needed in the next stimulus, we warned the congressional folks who are working on this, don't expect we're going to have a huge boom next fall. We expect we're going to drop by, on average, 20%. And what that means is that the schools know they're going to have to fire part-time and non-tenure track teachers. I just want to be blunt on it. They know this. Faculty and staff salaries may be cut. Maybe some tenure track people or tenured people will be laid off. What I'm seeing, and it's becoming typical at a Jesuit school these days, is that right about now, presidents have started announcing that they are going to take a 20% salary cut. And the vice presidents are usually planning to take a 10% salary cut. And this is, as far as I can tell, an alert to faculty and staff that they'll be next. The salary reset day in October is what presidents are beginning to talk about. And that's once we know what the revenue stream is going to be like, we'll know what we can pay the people that we are not going to entirely lay off. By the way, there are still, I think it's 14 of the 27, no, must be 13 of the 27 presidents are still Jesuits. And as you would be aware, the Jesuit doesn't feel very much loss when he cuts his salary by 20%. On the other hand, that salary is so big because they pay normal rates that the person who takes it in the chops is the guy who takes the money, the rector. And so it's the rector who is going to be the one who is saying to his Jesuit community, and I've had this happen a couple of times before, boys, gather around, we got to figure out how we can cut our standard of living. And so we will find that out in a sense with the presidents taking cuts, but then we will hear the same refrain again whenever that salary reset day in October comes, unless by some grace of God or simple magic, we suddenly have a bubbling up of more students next fall than schools are budgeting for. Now, I should explain something that is a common problem in Jesuit schools. Typically, as one president put it to me, most of his students have very little financial aid. They get a little, but that's because they have two parents who are working and are making decent salaries. They're middle class. And as the summer goes on, those parents are going to start losing their jobs. And there won't be enough financial aid to support those formerly middle-class students. You got to understand the discount rates in our schools are already over 50%. So if you pay $1 to any one of the schools, 50 cents or more of it is turned into financial aid to help the folks who are in greater need. And that's one reason, by the way, why we don't have as many really high need kids in our schools as we'd like to, simply because the really high need kids require so much money in terms of what's generated by those discounts that the rate is figured on. And therefore, I don't want to scare you, but there's an unknown. We don't know what schools will not open their doors this fall. What Jesuit schools will not open their doors this fall. And we will only find that out when we get much closer, I'm afraid, to opening date. So that's item one, if you will, the sudden reality of the schools as we're facing this COVID-19 and its ongoing impact. Second thing I'd like to talk about is what is it like to deal with the Department of Education? As a political scientist, I'm not finding that what I'm going to tell you is at all peculiar to the Trump administration. It is rather dealing with what happens in Washington bureaucracy, except now for me, it's such a vivid example. And there seem to be two elements. One, bureaucratic klutziness. I was born in New York, and so klutz is a word in my vocabulary. That one is where the bureaucracy just functions like a bureaucracy, and I'll tell you a little about that. But the second one is what I call mother may I politics, needing to get permission from somewhere way above your pay grade and your level of government. So bureaucratic klutziness. The CARES Act was passed very quickly, and the money was appropriated to the schools where 50% was emergency money for students in need, and they were to be given it in cash or the equivalent, but they were given the money. And the other 50% was given to the schools to help make up for their operating losses so far. Now, the Department of Ed tried to move fast, and they announced the availability of the student money first. If the schools would just sign a simple form they sent out online and send it back in, and they would give, and the form simply said, name of the school, the official of the school, and we promise that we will give out the money to the students according to the Department of Ed guidelines. Well, the only problem was they hadn't put out the guidelines yet. They were in a rush to announce that the money was available. And they had said they'll be coming in a day or two. So some schools signed right away. Most waited until the guidelines came out so that they would know what they were committing to as far as the rules. Well, after a week or a few days more than that, there were still no guidelines. The department was getting bad news stories about they made these announcements, but they hadn't yet sent any money out. It turned out that what they did was to announce publicly that only a few schools had sent in the form, and so that proved that most schools didn't need the money. That drew a strong reaction from the higher education associations. That's people like me who are the lobbyists. I'm not formally a lobbyist, but that's one of the things that HACU does. And then it turned out that the few schools that had sent in the form had not even received the money yet either. And so then there was the embarrassment for the department that no, well, they hadn't actually gotten around to sending any money out, and they'd work on that. And it wasn't the fault of the schools either that had sent in the forms or the ones who hadn't sent them in yet. It was just that the department wasn't able to cut checks. So the guidelines then came out 3 days later. But Then they had the problem that they guessed that the Trump administration would not want them to give money to either foreign students who were stuck in the US and were therefore much in need financially. Were stuck because they couldn't fly home, or to give money to DACA students who were on the campus who are not allowed by the current rules to get any federal money. Now, the CARES Act had not excluded either of those groups. The act had been written to just say, give the money to the really needy kids right now in this emergency. So what the Department of Ed hit upon, and this took them days, was saying, oh, well, we don't want to give you an answer about DACA kids and all that. We're just going to tell you that you have to use the same form that all kids who were applying for financial aid would be expected to use. And so it turned out that form was only filled out by about 2/3 of the kids, and any of the DACA students were not eligible to fill out the form, nor were the international students. And so the result was that they were very sorry that those students wouldn't be able to receive the money. What then came up to their embarrassment was that the forms have to be sent in to them, and it takes them about 6 weeks to decide whether the person who has sent it in qualifies. And this was supposed to be emergency money. And so they finally said to the schools, you make up your own form that they can fill out. They sign saying that they're telling the truth. And then they can have the money then. But they are not allowed to include DACA students or international students. So they ended up kind of blowing their cover and saying, yes, we don't want these included. What this did, though, was to add another, I believe, 10 days in which the kids who had the highest need couldn't get any money. We found out afterwards that what had happened is the mother may I politics, which is the Department of Ed had not issued its guidance in the first place, nor had it given answers about the DACA kids without sending it to the White House for review, approval, and guidance. The net result was that this simply delayed giving any kind of answers, even though what was desired was quick money. And the result was very angry congressmen from both parties who had meant the money to go immediately to highly needy students, citizens or not, in the emergency. The schools, meantime, were continuing to keep their dorms open and to incur costs that way, to keep their food service available for the non-citizen students and incur costs that way, but at the same time, those students couldn't be helped with any money. The result of this was that we are now all of us sitting around waiting for the DACA decision to be made by the Supreme Court, which we're quite sure is going to affirm that the president has the right to end the DACA program and to take any actions he wishes, as far as we can tell, to evict those students from the United States. We'll see how this all comes out. But in Washington, you've got a fairly unhappy reality. Another example, by the way, of Title IX. In the Obama years, a woman who was claiming that she was a sexual attack victim at a university tended to get the benefit of the doubt in an attempt to level the playing field that had existed for decades before that the woman had to prove her case and when there were no witnesses, and therefore she always was out of luck on getting any redress. So the idea was, well, we're going to do it better than the Obama folks did. So the Department of Ed started 3 years ago coming up with a new set of rules that would do a better job of leveling the playing field. This is admittedly a very hard job. The new rules came out yesterday, 3 years later. They are over 2,000 pages long. And these must be implemented by the schools by August the 14th. So 3 years to construct the rules, 3 months to retrain staff to implement a whole new process. The slow fruits of bureaucratic speed. And by the way, there will be all kinds of legal suits now because this tends to tilt the playing field pretty obviously too far in the direction of the accused and leaves the victim with very little redress again. Third thing I want to go into is the overall implications for Jesuit education in the future. Whatever happens to our schools, we must keep forming kids as they grow up. Online is fine for adults because by and large they're matured by experience. They've been down the road with losing jobs, with children being born imperfect, with a spouse who has major illness, and they're willing to reflect on the significance of these human events, which have by and large not happened to 18-year-olds. Remember Plato. I think his argument was that you shouldn't bother teaching philosophy to anyone under 35. And so it's easy to, in online ways, to engage the mature adults. When you are doing the same thing with kids, I was at Regis for 40 years. We pretty much pioneered online Jesuit education in the US. We found very early that you can't count on the young person with his lack of history to really take seriously and in depth the kind of questions that you can throw at experienced adults and get serious discussion from. And so what I think is clear is we're going to be doing more in the way of formation of young people. That's what's in the cards. And by the way, I should tell you, there is new research that's been developing in the last 2 or 3 years that the kids coming to Jesuit colleges, but to all Catholic colleges these days, tend to be in some ways in the situation that you don't expect them to be. They come unchurched by their parents. They come without the kind of training that comes from being in a Catholic school where you learn catechism, advanced things in theology, all the rest. And so they're the great unwashed, the great unchurched. And we're finding that those kids are really interested in what they have been deprived of. But that's where what we have to do with the college age kid is real formation. And help that person to come to the point where they make their decisions, they make their commitments. They come now with hunger that they may not even recognize and unrest. It might be a good thing to just throw in here a thing that goes back to John Panagiotou of Wheeling. What we learned when Wheeling lost its Jesuit sponsorship was the provincial's decision spoke for Jesuits all across the country. If you remove philosophy, if you remove serious theology, if you remove literature from education in a school and call it Jesuit, you're lying. With all due respects, you're not telling the truth. Those things are essentials of a Jesuit school. Another item, our schools do need to cooperate more to help each other. They need some things that are real simple, but just don't go through quickly. It has to be easier to transfer from one Jesuit school to another. After all, it's not necessary for every one of the 27 to offer all the majors that the others offer. So if you took 2 years at a school that didn't have the major you eventually decided you wanted to take, you should be able to transfer to another Jesuit school that has that and move right ahead because you had a Jesuit core curriculum. But it's not easy to do right now. We're exploring, but only exploring, the possibilities of what they call domestic study abroad, where you do a year, you do 2 years, let's say, at John Carroll, and then you do a year at University of San Francisco, and then you go back to John Carroll. There's good experimentation going on in the Midwest province. They have a bunch of what are called green academic programs. And the faculty in those tend to meet and critique each other's programs annually. Loyola Chicago has urban sustainability with that 3-story greenhouse. Marquette has green engineering. Detroit Mercy has green architecture. And John Carroll in Cleveland and Xavier in Cincinnati and Creighton in Omaha, they share with those other schools the essential issues of water protection, making sure the water is pure and remains therefore usable for generations. That's the kind of thing that is producing good collaborative work. And then beyond that, a lot of progress has been made in terms of following what the Jesuit General has been inviting us to. So you have the Ignatian Colleagues Program, which is 18 months long for faculty and staff. They take 55 people a year, and it's an 18-month program, including an immersion experience outside the United States normally, and an 8-day retreat, and 650 people have graduated from that now. Jesuit Leadership Seminars is only a week, and it's a way to get your toes wet if you're new to Jesuit education and you want to decide, do I want to go deeply into Ignatian spirituality? There's a new venture called the Jesuit Mission Workshops for Trustees. That seems to be going very well. The mission priorities examen we were invited to by Father Nicholas. Each school is reviewed by peers from other Jesuit schools and determines what are the things it really wants to focus on for the next few years, and then reports in each year on how it's doing. And a peer visiting group critiques its initial choice, and then the provincial writes a letter of opinion to Father General, and then Father General makes the decision whether a school is still Jesuit and Catholic. The bishop, by the way, is invited to get involved in the process by putting his opinion in early for consideration, but it's the general who decides that the school is Jesuit and Catholic. And those are all really hopeful things, that whether we end up with 50 Jesuit universities or with 5, are marks that Jesuit education is likely to continue well. I've talked longer than I had intended to. Sorry about that, folks. Time for questions. Amy?
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you. We have a couple questions. First of all, did you address, did you want me to ask, or did you address a few of the questions that came in from Mike Canaris at Loyola?
Yeah. I tried to answer that partly.
Okay.
What I hope his group will do is answer their questions. They are together as a serious group of scholars who are dealing with what graduate ministerial programs are going to be doing, how their challenges will build up. And what is needed is that they come up with proposals. And therefore, it's really foolhardy for me to say, here are the answers. And the talk about little coordination in Catholic universities, I'm afraid I really only know and speak of Jesuit universities here. And I've tried to talk about how we have been trying to really build mission deeply in to what's going on in the schools. And the third one was after COVID, what is going to happen? The Jesuit institutions can offer higher education landscape together that they can't offer alone. I talked about working together, but I don't have the crystal ball that I think they do have. I'd like their group that is together not to critique my ideas, but to come up with their own about what Jesuit schools or what survives of Jesuit schools might be doing.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here from Annie Selleck. And her question is, for universities facing closure in the fall, do you think it would be closures or withdrawal of Jesuit sponsorship like at Wheeling?
No, I think it would be closure. The Jesuit sponsorship angle is not built on financial viability. What is possible always is that a school that might be coming up to closure would partner with a much stronger Jesuit school and have that school take over their program. Where the difficulty comes in that is that very often the faculty from the school that is on the verge of closure find that their tenure doesn't go to the school that is taking them over. And so I want to be blunt, that's very hard to do.
Okay. There's another question from Aaron Salzman. Given the multiple schools, including the University of California system, that have divested from fossil fuel companies for purely financial reasons, why have only 2 Jesuit universities divested? Divestment help protect our endowments from further damage.
Yeah, well, the divestment protects our endowment from further damage is very true, but it is a brand new argument. When I have brought this to the presidents twice during my time, the response has been, there isn't really a problem or a solution. We still need the fossil fuels, and so we're not going to make this move. I think now you will see many more schools make the move in this direction as it becomes financially smart. But let's be blunt, that's financially smart. It's not because virtue has set in some of these cases. I believe the University of Seattle and Georgetown have both pulled out of fossil fuels. I thought there was a third, but I don't remember which one.
Okay. A third question here is from Ira Gorman. You began talking about the impact to SLU and their healthcare programs, but spoke a lot about traditional undergraduate education. What about the many graduate healthcare programs in Jesuit universities and how these programs and students are impacted? They seem to be different with unique problems.
Well, yeah, the graduate programs in each school are going to be uniquely different, I'm afraid. And you take a school like St. Louis U, if you go back a ways, it eliminated its engineering school. It now then developed aeronautical engineering from something very small to a fairly significant engineering program. It seems to me that each school is going to make its own decisions in terms of market possibilities. And I think that's right after World War II, when they did the approach of every tub on its own bottom, each school stands alone, its trustees are responsible for it. Part of the idea was the trustees are going to know the local conditions and the regional conditions in a way the Jesuit provincials and Father General don't know them. And so you do leave it to the school to decide, do we need another law school, or is it time we dropped ours? We had more medical schools in the past. Marquette had a medical school and dropped it. And that, I think, has been usually well done.
Okay. The last question I see here is from John Shevland, and it's lay compassions and mission are obviously a crucial component of Jesuit universities remaining viable. What are the best practices you see among our universities for lay companionship and mission?
First, it's an old insight that of the different spiritualities of the different religious orders, the Jesuit spirituality is the one that fits best for most lay people. And it's because it is built around that insight that our job as Christians is to make a better world. And that means when you go into business, when you build your family, when you serve your own community. And so the future of Jesuit education is the lay people who are more and more the leadership and who have been for so many years already the great majority of faculty and staff. As far as how that Jesuit tradition goes forward, it seems to me that the Jesuits who used to think of themselves as being the quarterback on the team have gradually moved to seeing themselves as the coaches and then the cheerleaders. And so what you're going to find is Ignatian spirituality being done by a few Jesuits who will have a deeper exposure, but then by a growing number of very well-prepared lay people. Right now, if there's somebody that is looking for a really good guide to what should we do to make our school more Jesuit, the person I send them to is Stephanie Russell, who is formerly the vice president at Marquette for 15 years. She's now on the AJCU board, or AJCU employee list, and she is just simply extraordinarily good. And so that's where you go to get somebody who will train your campus ministers, who will help your mission vice president to learn the tricks of the trade, whether that person happens to be a Jesuit or a lay person. And so I think the future is in lay people. What the concrete things are going to be in terms of what kinds of institutions there will be, I just don't know. I just figure as long as we stay faithful to the mission, that the Spirit is going to open up new ways.
Well, Mike, we're coming up to the hour. I just want to thank you so much for sharing the major issues that the schools are facing due to the pandemic, the economic as well as educational and formation-wise. Also delineating the unknowns. I think a lot of us are reading and thinking and wondering, and I think sometimes even knowing having what we don't know outlined is helpful. I also really am grateful for you sharing the realities of our situation, but all in the context of concern for Jesuit education, higher education. So thank you so much. And I thank all of our members who joined.